was able to do that. I think that this is probably the finest relief carving ever done in Egypt. It's absolutely exquisite.
But take us through them.
Well, here we see the pharaoh, Seti I. He's holding an incense burner. You see the flames from the burning incense coming up there.
Very clearly.
He's offering this to an image of the god Osiris, attended by various other deities. You see Osiris enthroned on a raised platform here, inside a shrine, which is just indicated by these thin lines that encircle the image.
Where would this shrine itself have been?
Well, the temple had a number of chapels dedicated to various deities. One of these was dedicated to Osiris, and this image, or the image that this represents, would have been in that chapel.
Can we go and see?
Sure. This is the chapel of Osiris, and we see him in various guises here, with the king making offerings of incense and libation offerings, adoring the image of the god. It really gives a sense of what the original decoration of most Egyptian temples would have been. It would have been this incredibly vibrant and alive color. It almost looks as though the artists put down their brushes and left the temple yesterday. The images here help us a great deal in understanding the nature of temple ritual, but the Seti temple here isn't only important for Egyptologists to understand gods' cults and temple ritual, it also has a singular significance in Egyptian history. On the wall in this room, we actually have one of the most important historical documents from ancient Egypt. It's something that has been of immense value to Egyptologists in understanding the sequence of Egyptian history. It's a list of the names of the kings of ancient Egypt. Starts at the beginning with the name of King Mendes. Here it says Meni, who was the legendary founder of ancient Egypt, and it continues all the way through most of the rulers of ancient Egypt, all the way to Seti, here at the end, who built this temple.
So it's an amazing stretch of history, isn't it?
Absolutely. This represents almost 2,000 years of Egyptian history.
And it's just a list. Is that the only importance it has? What else does it tell us?
Well, it tells us of the Egyptians' own awareness of the great depth of their history. Egyptology would have had a much more difficult time in putting together the overall outline of ancient Egyptian history without this document and others like it.
Although Seti I is the last name on this list, he died before his temple could be fully completed. It was finished by his son, Ramesses. But history will forever know it as Seti's gift to the ages, a beautiful monument to the deep spirituality and artistic greatness of ancient Egypt. In 1570 BC, 1,000 years after the Great Pyramids were built, a new era in Egyptian history began. It was called the New Kingdom. The great pharaohs of this period, such as Seti I's son, Ramesses, possessed enormous power and prestige. They would expand and perfect an altogether different category of temple.
We're crossing the Nile at the site of the ancient holy city of Thebes. Just down there on that bank is the town of Luxor and the temple of Karnak. But it was to this bank that the pharaohs turned to create a new kind of temple. These were not dedicated to a particular god like Amun at Karnak or Osiris at Abydos, but rather they were mortuary temples dedicated to the honor of a living god, the pharaoh himself.
Pharaohs had always required a site where, even after death, they could receive praise and offerings. A suitable place where their memory could be worshipped on a daily basis. It was not enough for the body to remain preserved. The glorious memory of the dead king also had to be maintained, if he was to keep his proper place in eternity. Pyramids had spaces for such activities incorporated into their design. But when tomb robbers forced the pharaohs to seek smaller, more secure tombs in the Valley of the Kings, a need was created for a special memorial structure. The result was the mortuary temple, and one of the most elegant of these was built across the river from Karnak by Ramesses II. The spectacular temple he created is known as the Ramesseum. It was a fitting monument to the pharaoh known to history as Ramesses the Great. Its location, the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, was really an enormous cemetery complex covering dozens of square miles. The great mortuary temples the pharaohs built here were all very close to each other. Just down the road from the Ramesseum is Medinet Habu, the beautiful temple built by Ramesses III. And not far away from this spot sits another great testament to power and ego.
We're on our way to visit the most spectacular of the mortuary temples, a temple that was built to honor one of Egypt's greatest pharaohs, a pharaoh who was not a king, but a queen.
Her name was Hatshepsut, the same queen who had built the Red Chapel at Karnak. Initially, she was less a queen than the wife of a king, Thutmose II to be exact, but when her husband died, the title of king passed to a boy, Hatshepsut's stepson, Thutmose III. The boy was too young to rule, and so Hatshepsut became regent to command Egypt until the young king matured. But this remarkable woman possessed great self-confidence and abundant ambition. In the second year of her stepson's reign, Hatshepsut had herself designated king. She decreed that she would now be depicted not as a woman, but as a man, complete with the traditional false beard of a pharaoh. Hatshepsut's reign was peaceful and Egypt prospered. Trading expeditions were sent to distant lands, and the queen mounted enormous building projects. None were more ambitious than her construction of a temple to memorialize herself. Nearly 1,500 years before the Christian era, Queen Hatshepsut began the construction of a temple to honor her reign. She chose this spectacular site, a natural amphitheater of stone, cliffs 1,000 feet high. Today, it is called Deir El Bahari, but to the ancients, it was the sublime of the sublimes. Hatshepsut's architect was named Senenmut. Some believe he was also her lover. She asked him to design a temple which would amaze the ages. He did not fail. No builder in ancient Egypt had a greater sense of theatrics than Senenmut. 3 perfectly scaled terraces rise out of the valley floor and seem to meld with the towering cliffs which surround the temple. Carefully proportioned ramps connected these tiers. Statues of the queen were everywhere, and in the soft tones of the desert dawn or twilight, the temple's stones gave off a magical glow, which proclaimed to eternity Hatshepsut's sanctity and greatness. But fame can be fleeting. Hatshepsut's control of this wonderful temple was to be brief. Work on this architectural masterpiece began in the 7th year of Hatshepsut's reign and continued for 15 more years. This temple was built in her honor, so her image is everywhere. Hatshepsut as pharaoh, Hatshepsut as the god Osiris. But although her temple is still here 3,500 years later, most of the images of the great queen herself were destroyed soon after her death. Thutmose III became pharaoh of Egypt in 1483 BC. He was convinced that his stepmother should never have been pharaoh. So, as his reign came to an end, Thutmose did his best to obliterate the queen's image from her own temple. But time was the greatest enemy here. Later occupants continued the defacement of carvings, and earthquakes tumbled walls and columns.
By the 20th century, Hatshepsut's beautiful temple was in a sad condition. Paving stones had heaved out of line. Huge blocks from balustrades lay collapsed in jumbled piles. But in 1960, the Egyptian government funded a restoration project, working with a group of Polish Egyptologists. It's been a model of international cooperation.
Critical parts of the temple, particularly the third tier, lay scattered like a huge stack of children's blocks. The first task was to analyze these blocks and, one at a time, put them back into their places. We were granted access to sections of the temple that have been closed for more than 30 years. It was a rare opportunity to see the restoration work up close. Old methods are used to recreate the missing parts. Stone is cut from the original quarries and brought here to Deir El Bahari. Local Egyptian carvers are separated from the original artisans who worked here by thousands of years, but the care and attention to detail is identical.
Each one of these stones is cut by hand, placed by hand and eye, shaped to exactly fit. And then, after this one, they have to go step by step up this great ramp to the third tier. And for the first time since ancient times, it'll be complete. There's hundreds of men working here. You can imagine in ancient times, thousands working side by side in the heat to complete this great monument.
With funding limited, there is no modern machinery here. Instead, workers bend their backs to their heavy loads. To provide a rhythm, they cry out a work chant in praise of the Prophet Muhammad.
Like their ancestors centuries ago, they pull these great stones up the ramp using only their hands. And of course, these guys have got wheels. The ancient Egyptians, well, maybe they used sledges. It's still hard work. These limestone blocks are modern, but they're cut to exactly the same tolerances as the ancient stone would have been. And each block is a copy, an exact copy of what was here before. Like a piece of a giant jigsaw puzzle, a section of Hatshepsut's original temple is eased into place on its modern counterpart.
Piece by piece, Deir El Bahari is put back together. Funds for this work are difficult to obtain. It has taken over 30 years, but at last, the end is in sight. And we can again see Egypt's great queen gazing over her marvelous temple.
Each year during a special festival, the god Amun-Re would be brought here, to the third tier of the temple of Hatshepsut. The statue of the god would be taken in procession across this courtyard, back there, into a cavern dug into the mountain. There he would rest for a few days before beginning his progress through all the temples of the West Bank. The public have never been allowed access to this place, but soon the work of restoration will be completed, and visitors will at last be able to stand here on the sacred terrace and enjoy a view of the Nile once looked upon by Queen Hatshepsut herself.
Like all ancient structures in Egypt, the great temples face many threats from time and the elements.